thank you very much for joining us. You were formerly the chairman of the 1922 committee. Can you, for the people who don't know what that is, can you just explain what the 1922 committee is and what role does the chairman play?
The 1922 committee is really the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It just has an interesting, quirky, old-fashioned name. It was originally set up by newly elected Conservative MPs, elected for the first time in November 1922, and that's where the name comes from. But then gradually over time it expanded to be the whole of the backbench, and when we're in opposition it's all Conservative MPs apart from the leader.
And in your role you have to, or you've have had to tell Prime Ministers that it's time to resign. The tide is turning against you. What's it like to do that?
I mean, they're difficult conversations, and they're not pleasant conversations either, because obviously you're very conscious you're with somebody at a very crucial point in their career, in their life. They're typically people who've worked their whole lives up to that point of assuming the highest political office in the land, and to reach that end game where it's gone wrong for whatever reason is clearly a very emotional moment for them and a very difficult moment.
And I think you were heavily involved in the downfall of three Prime Ministers, Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. You told Theresa May that she'd reached the threshold and she was going to face a vote of no confidence. What was that like?
I mean, that was fairly straightforward because it's a process. We have a system whereby 15% of the members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party write to the chairman of the 1922 committee asking for a confidence vote. One has to take place. So that was a simple matter of telling her that the threshold had been reached. We had to do it. She said, "How soon can you do it?" I said, "We can do it tomorrow if you want." And she said, please do that. She wanted it out of the way, clear the decks, and know whether she was in a position to move on or not. But the more difficult conversations came later, when things had got even worse. We were in that Brexit impasse. Nothing really could be done. We couldn't resolve it one way or another. And there was simply no government majority to achieve what had to be done. So the pressure was mounting from parliamentary colleagues to change the rules of the 1922 committee and allow a second confidence vote within 12 months of the first. And a number of us thought that would be the wrong thing to do, and instead we wanted to allow Theresa to go with some dignity, with a little bit of agency of her own over the way it happened. But that was, again, it was a much more difficult process trying to persuade her that that was the way she should go.
How did that go? Did you tell her if you don't choose to resign with dignity, we will be forced to get rid of you?
Well, I mean, the way it ended up in the end, quite a bizarre situation. Somebody on the 22 executive proposed that we should vote on whether to change the rules or not to allow a second confidence vote, but that I would keep those votes in a sealed envelope and only open it if Theresa wouldn't name her own date for leaving office. I've still got that sealed envelope at home now. It was in a safe in my office, and I strongly suspect that it was a vote to change the rules.
She went through quite a tough time as Prime Minister, especially in those final months. Did you feel sorry for her?
Yes, but I think I would say in my 27 years in the House of Commons, that was the most awful, painful time for everybody in the House of Commons in particular, but in Parliament, I guess, as a whole. And it was the most frustrating, the most tense and difficult. People were falling out. There was no obvious solution that could be found. I tried by tabling what was known at the time as the Brady Amendment, which was to say we would accept the withdrawal agreement that Theresa was proposing, but without the famous Northern Irish backstop. And we got the government to support that. Theresa backed me. It was the only positive motion relating to Brexit that got passed in that 17 to 19 Parliament. And then within 5 days, I can remember I was watching the TV news and Theresa May was on a visit to Northern Ireland. I think she was in Belfast. And a journalist said, "And Mrs May, what do you think about the backstop?" And she said, "We want to keep the backstop." And I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. So I remember texting the Prime Minister and just saying, "Theresa, I've just seen you answering a question in Belfast that you want to keep the backstop. Can I remind you that it's only 5 days since you got the government to support my motion in Parliament, which said the exact opposite."
And then came Boris Johnson, who he had his ready-made deal. He won the general election with a massive mandate. What was your relationship like with him as his as an advisor to the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, we'd always got on reasonably well, and I think Boris had often agreed with positions that I'd taken on grammar schools, for instance. But I think when he became Prime Minister with that big majority, I don't think he really thought he had any great need for advice from the chairman of the 1922 committee. So I wasn't seeing him very much. When he engaged with the 1922 committee, there tended to be a huge number of his own advisors coming with him. So it was a long time until I started to have a proper sort of personal one-to-one relationship with him in office. But of course, at that point, I thought with a majority of 80, with the new Prime Minister obviously thinking he could do pretty much what he wanted to do, I thought I was going to have a very dull 5 years as chairman of the 1922 committee, and it couldn't have been further from the truth.
I guess eventually you started having regular meetings with him when you when you were receiving that amount of letters from Tory MPs calling for a vote of no confidence. What was it like giving advice to someone who maybe didn't want to hear it?
Well, I mean, Boris was very much as you see him on the television. He was, very forceful, very vigorous. He would argue, say, if they want to do that, they're mad. I've won this huge majority. I secured a mandate. I've got so many things still to do. And that was the final conversation that we had the night before his resignation, where I had suggested that I thought that the game was up, and I thought that, again, the pressure to change the rules and allow another vote of confidence was intense. We'd had a new 22 executive just elected with a fresh mandate, and I was pretty certain that it was going to vote to do that the following week. So there would have been a confidence vote. I think he was going to lose it at that point. And that was the advice that I gave him. But Boris said, nope, I'm going to fight on. This is, I'm going to smash through. I've got so much still to do. And that was the 6 o'clock on the Wednesday night. And then on the Thursday morning, I got a telephone call very early saying the Prime Minister wanted to speak to me. He called me, I think, about 8:30 in the morning and said, I've reconsidered overnight. I'll be making a statement later today.
Did he have a duty to call you as the chairman of the 1922, or did he?
No, I think it was a courtesy that he did, in particular because we'd had the conversation we'd had the night before, and I was certainly grateful to know what was going to happen. And very important at the time, of course, he knew that he could rely on me not to pass the news on, so it would remain confidential until the Downing Street operation wanted to make clear what was happening.
What was it that went wrong for Boris Johnson? Because on one side we've got people saying it was his decision to stick with Chris Pincher that broke the dam, and a lot of people in the public at least don't really know about that, and they say Partygate was the problem. What's your assessment?
I think it was both added together, but my assessment would be that the rows about events in Downing Street, the so-called Partygate events, that had built quite significantly. We'd had a confidence vote. Boris had won it, but he'd not won it that comfortably. So he was wounded by that. But it was very difficult to see where that additional number of discontented colleagues was going to come from that would push it to that further point. And it was the most unexpected thing because the Chris Pincher affair arising from some drunken antics in the Carlton Club late one night was not what one would expect to bring down a Prime Minister. And it was very much Boris's handling of it that caused the problem. And I think in particular, the fact that ministers were being sent out to speak on the media with a line to take, which sometimes before the interview had ended had emerged that it was unravelling and it wasn't quite accurate. And so I think a lot of his ministerial colleagues got very angry at that point because they thought they were being let down. They were being put in the firing line unnecessarily and people weren't being straight with them. So in the end, of course, it was resignations of ministers that led to Boris's resignation.
Did you hear from those ministers that were being sent out on the broadcast rounds to tell a line from the government that quickly was reversed. Did you hear from them how angry they were?
Look, the House of Commons is a fairly small place. We all bump into each other all the time. So, of course, I would chat to ministers I passed in the corridor, and somebody who'd just been on the Today programme, and he'd be fuming that what he'd had to say has just emerged, that it wasn't true. And we would have those conversations. And I can remember saying to one in particular, but why do you do it? But there we are. They reached the point where they wouldn't do it anymore.
And soon after that came the leadership contest that eventually saw Rishi Sunak face off against Liz Truss. How did you feel about that contest?
Well, as the person running it, the thing that frustrated me most was how long it was. And I sought a shorter contest. The representatives of the voluntary party sitting on the board wanted to have hustings meetings all over the country going on over a period of a couple of months. And I thought that was bad for the party, I thought it was bad for the country, and it was actually quite bad for the two candidates involved, because they thought they'd put their argument so many times. And also Liz Truss had established a fairly early lead, and whilst that was eroded a little bit over the course of the summer, it wasn't going to switch to support for Rishi Sunak as to the extent that he needed. So it was a sort of gruelling contest for them. And then obviously we reached the end point, and I announced that Liz Truss had won. I recount in the book that when I went to see her for the first time as Prime Minister, item number one on my agenda was just to check that she had the 1922 committee's centenary dinner in her diary, as the previous Prime Minister had had. And so this would have been in late October. The dinner was going to be on the 1st of February. Of course, it never crossed my mind that we would have yet another Prime Minister by then.
How soon in Liz Truss's premiership did you start to realise that it might not be the longest lasting?
Well, I think the mini-budget and the fallout from it clearly shook the foundations, and there was a big opinion poll hit. There was a lot of uncertainty caused by it and instability. So it was clear that she'd been seriously wounded by those events. Normally, things take much longer to come to a conclusion, though. And again, it's the surprising thing, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And in her case, it was the event surrounding quite an inconsequential vote in the House of Commons on what we call an opposition day motion. They don't change anything. It wasn't going to make the law different or anything like that. But at the start of the day, the government had said that the vote on this motion relating to fracking was going to be treated as a matter of confidence, which means that any Conservative who voted with the Labour Party over it would lose the whip. And by the end of the debate, it emerged that it wasn't a matter of confidence. And this led to rather chaotic scenes as we went into the division lobbies. We had the Chief Whip and the Deputy Chief Whip resigning. We had the Prime Minister running after them, trying to stop them resigning. We had colleagues not knowing whether they were forced to go in and vote against the motion or whether they could vote the other way. And it was the most chaotic scene that I've ever witnessed in the House of Commons.
She blames the establishment and the media for her downfall. Do you think that's fair?
I think there may be elements of it that are fair, but fundamentally what happened was a badly handled mini-budget which had real consequences. Some of the consequences were hard to predict because there were certain rules relating to certain types of pensions and investments which a lot of people weren't aware of. So the consequences were more pronounced than what anybody had anticipated. But that was the fundamental problem. And then, as I say, rather than having a smooth period to recover from that, we then had this bizarre, chaotic day, evening in the House of Commons, and that just seemed to make everybody think this can't work. And she, of course, resigned the next day. And
what was your involvement in her final few hours?
Well, I went to see her. She'd asked to see me at the same time I was asking to see her. I went in thinking, well, this might be a difficult conversation. We sat down. She said, "Graham, how bad do you think it is?" I said, "I'm afraid I think it's very bad." She said, "I agree." She then said, do you think it's retrievable? And I said, I'm really sorry, but I'm afraid I don't think it is. And she said, I've come to the same conclusion. So it was actually a very easy conversation, but it was then followed by a slightly surreal experience in that having been in that position before with other prime ministers, I knew there would be 200 journalists out in the Downing Street in front of the famous Black Door. I didn't want to go and walk through that crowd. So I said to her, I now need a car to take me back to the Palace of Westminster, or if you prefer, I'm happy to stay in this building until you've made your statement. She said, we'll do that. We'll keep you hostage here. So I was then found a spare office and a television to watch, and it brought a tuna sandwich and a mug of tea, a phone charger. So I was sitting there for a couple of hours watching the unfolding news, a lot of your colleagues filling time, as you sometimes have to do. And so I'm listening to the news saying, Graham Brady has now been in a meeting with the Prime Minister for 2.5 hours. She's been joined by the Chief Whip, the party chairman and the Leader of the House of Commons. And of course, I knew that I'd had a very brief meeting with the Prime Minister and was sitting eating a tuna sandwich.
As chairman of the 1922 committee, you swear to secrecy. When you receive these letters of no confidence in leaders, you do not reveal how many you've received, or if you've received any at all. As journalists, we were, during Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, constantly reporting Graham Brady's received X amount of letters. What's that like for you, as you obviously know the truth and many journalists are speculating?
Yeah, I mean, it can be frustrating, obviously, but I learned very early on that the only thing that a chairman of the 1922 committee can say about the number of letters that have been received is nothing at all. And that lesson, oddly, was taught to me by James Forsyth, who was then the political editor of The Spectator, went on to be Rishi Sunak's political secretary. But James, very assiduous journalist, and he was speaking to me very soon after David Cameron had become Prime Minister. And he said, so one thing, Graham, he said, have you received any letters calling for a vote of no confidence? And I said, James, don't be absurd. He's only just become Prime Minister. And then a few weeks later, he asked me the same question. And I gave a rather different answer and was a little more evasive. He said, I notice you don't think it's absurd to ask the question anymore. And at that point, I realised that any tiny bit of detail that you give, even if it's denying that there are any letters, it puts you in a position where journalists can then draw inferences and it starts to build a picture. So from that point on, I said nothing at all to anybody. And of course, that's difficult sometimes. You're guarding an important secret. And then when you get people reporting that you're that close to the threshold and you know that you're not, it would be so tempting to say this is complete rubbish. I haven't got 50 letters, I've got far fewer, but then you've given it away.
You also presided over leadership elections as well as the downfall of some leaders. And we've got another leadership election ongoing at the moment. What's your thought on the current pool of candidates?
Well, I think given the Conservative Party had such a crushing defeat very recently, I think we're actually in a very good position, having now 4 very good candidates who are all capable of doing the job and doing it well. And, you know, that's a very happy situation for a party that's only got just over 120 members of Parliament. So I'm reassured by that. I think, obviously, I want the next Conservative Party leader to become the next Conservative Prime Minister, and for that to be in 4 or 5 years' time, all the way the current government's going at the moment. It could be sooner than that even. So that would be great from my point of view, but whatever your politics, it's really important to have a good, strong, effective opposition. So I think getting one of those really capable people in as leader of the opposition is going to be important for the country.
There's 2 different directions the party could go in, depending on the result of this leadership election. And one is further to the right, one is closer to the centre. What do you think would be the best policy for the party?
I think that the great Keith Joseph, back in the Thatcher days, came up with the term, he said, it's not about the left or right, it's about the common ground. It's not about the centre ground, the common ground. And there are things that actually most normal people would like. They want to be safe in the streets. They want to know that their children can go to a decent school. They want to know that when they earn their money through hard work, that they're going to keep most of it themselves to spend on what their priorities are for their family. And they want to know there's some security for people living in this country. So I don't think any of those things is right wing or centre or left wing, they're things which are absolutely central to most people's desires and aspirations for themselves and their families. And that has always been the core purpose of the Conservative Party, to deliver that. And we've had a rocky few years, facing some quite extraordinary challenges, whether it be a coalition government, which is very unusual in our system, whether it be the Brexit referendum and the fallout from that, which caused a political turmoil, whether it be the COVID pandemic, whether it be the invasion of Ukraine. These are all unusual pressures. It's been a lot to cope with. And maybe that's obscured some of that central, basic, common sense, common ground conservatism. That's what we've got to deliver.
Have you decided who you're going to be voting for?
I haven't. And, I may be a Conservative member of the House of Lords now, but that doesn't give me any special vote in the leadership election. So my only vote will be as a member of the Conservative Party voting in the final stage when we're down to 2 candidates. So I'm certainly going to wait until we've got those 2 before I make a decision.
On that, do you think members should be given the final say on deciding the leader? Because they did that with Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, and it feels like it was quickly decided that they chose the wrong candidate.
I don't think it was quickly decided by parliamentary colleagues. What they were saying to me after Liz Truss was elected is, even if they were surprised, even if they'd supported Rishi Sunak instead, they'd say, well, we've got to make this work. We can't go through this all over again. Of course, we went through it all over again quite soon. So I don't think that was the problem. My view is that when we are in opposition, it's absolutely fine to give the members a final choice. When the party is in government, I think it's different. In our system, you remain Prime Minister if you enjoy the confidence of the House of Commons. And essentially, that means you need the support of your own party when it's the majority party. So it seems sensible to me that you would align the selectorate that chooses a Prime Minister with the body which has the say over whether they stay or go. So that's my inclination. I don't think it'll change, though, because the Conservative Party constitution is difficult to change. You need, I think, a 2/3 majority of the people representing the members. I think it's unlikely they're going to follow that course. So I think we probably have this system for the foreseeable future. The one thing that I would offer as a way of improving it is that at the end point, when we have the 2 final candidates put forward by the parliamentary party to the members, I think that we should have a further ballot of MPs, so that when there are just 2 candidates, you can see what the preference is in the parliamentary party. Wouldn't oblige the membership to come to the same conclusion, but it would mean the membership was better informed about what the opinion of the parliamentary party was. And if you had a situation where 120 members of parliament were balloted and 110 of them favoured one candidate and 10 of them favoured the other, then it might just raise eyebrows and make people wonder whether they ought to follow the same path.
And very quickly onto the current government, Keir Starmer he's had a tough few weeks as Prime Minister. If you could give him any advice, not that you would want him to remain Prime Minister, but if you could give him any advice to stay in power, what would you say?
Well, of course, I don't want Keir Starmer to remain Prime Minister, but I do want us to have a stable and competent government. And I think, the tough few weeks that he's had, it's been completely self-inflicted, whether it be the winter fuel allowance, which was breaking the promise that was given before the election, and they did it almost as soon as they were in office. And I can understand why people are so angry about that. And then all of the stuff about treats and gifts and freebies and donations, the use of £18 million penthouses and so on. It just seems a bit extreme. Politicians
have been receiving donations as long as politics has been around. Do you feel the system of donations needs to change?
I think there's a big difference between donations that are for political purposes, to make the system run, to make the party run, to provide staff, to provide campaign resources, and things which are going in very large sums of money to individuals to buy glasses, clothes, whatever, clothes for the other half. It's I just think that feels very different. It's very much a personal benefit.
You were chairman of the 1922 committee for 14 years. What's your favourite anecdote, story that you can tell from those? those years?
Yes, I mean, there are so many, but one of them, which just really amused me, and I have put in my book, is that when we were running that leadership election that ended up being between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, it was a very, very hot summer, and we had repeated rounds of voting amongst the MPs before we got down to the final two. And we had a system that we would announce the results at a particular time, which was largely for the benefit of the main news programmes. And that seemed to be a very sensible thing to do. But we also got quite efficient in the counting of votes. So the officers of the 1922 committee would count the votes, and then we'd have a little while to sit in a room. Nobody could leave the room because we didn't want it to leak at all. So we'd sit in there and try to come up with something to entertain ourselves and entertain the waiting public and the press. So we started taking some slightly jokey photographs. One of them on the hottest day, we had a lot of fans all around us, and that was posted out on social media. And then I think it was the final one, Naz Ghani, one of my vice chairmen, suggested that we should get a china teapot and some cups and saucers, and so we pretended that we were sipping tea all standing around, and she was pouring the tea, and that was put out, and it was just a little joke, and it was her idea. And then I think it was the New York Times that reported that this was an appalling instance of conservative misogyny and colonialism because we had a woman of colour forced to pour the tea for the white men. So you do get some slightly ridiculous moments.